All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Cities Lead an Embodied Carbon Policy Framework. The learning objectives for this session are shown on the screen, and we will be following up with a survey for all attendees that will collect more information so that you can receive credits from the American Institute of Architects if you are interested. We will also collect questions submitted to the Q&A box throughout the session, and if our speakers aren't able to get to all of your questions, we will have them answer your questions in writing and share their answers on the website after the teach-in. All right, and so it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session. First, myself, I'm Erin McDade. I'm with Architecture 2030, and we have Cécile Faraud and Natasha Balwit who will be presenting today. And I'm going to get started with a quick introduction to Cécile. Cécile Faraud leads the Clean Construction Program at C40, the network of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. Through her work, Cécile supports market dialogues and collaborates with key global and national stakeholders representing the private sector and advocates for a whole life and circular approach to our built environment. All right, Cécile, it is all you.
Thanks so much, Erin, and hi everyone. It's a great pleasure.
Having trouble hearing you again though.
Sorry, can you hear me again?
Perfect, yep.
Great, sorry. Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Erin, for the intro. I will share my screen with you now so you can all see. Great.
You're good.
Perfect. So really, C40 is a network of 96 cities, and you can see all the colored dots on the map representing all of the C40 cities. And we're really pleased to be there today because this network of cities really connect the leading cities on their bold action to tackle one of our most important challenge, which is the climate crisis. And it's kind of a fact that we cannot escape at the moment, that the kids that are demonstrating all over the world to call us on the reality of climate emergency are right. And if mayors need to act at the moment, and if a network of cities is really important in our days, it's because our national government, or especially our Western, I would say, national government, are failing us in taking responsibility for this agenda. And therefore, mayors who are in more direct contact with the impact of climate change need to take action and are taking action. And the reason is that they are affected at the moment and really experiencing what the climate is with only 1 degree of overheating. And we've seen a number of extremely rare and first of a kind or worst event in living memory happening within our city with only 1 degree of warming on top. So it's going to be even worse if the overwarming of cities continue. So basically in Lima, we had in 2017, the worst flooding in living memory. We had in Cape Town, we almost reached the point 0 where the reserve of water were going to be dry and people would have to be rationed. We are seeing in the US and in Australia last year, devastating and really unprecedented levels of wildfires that really do affect cities. There are also floods in Dakar that are not that much covered by the media. There are many other ways that cities are experiencing how they are affected by the climate change. So this is exactly why we need to tackle and we need to start working where the emissions are the most important. And construction is one of the most important contributing industry to the climate crisis. And where does construction happen? Construction does happen in cities. So to give you a scale of what is going to happen, by 2050, we know that another 2.5 billion people will be complementing the urban population that we have now, which means that by 2025, we need to build 1 billion new homes. Also, by 2050, 60% of the landscape that will surround us haven't yet been built and need to be built, which means that this will intensify the needs for construction and therefore the pressure on our built environment and the emissions that it emits. And overall, to give a kind of scale of this again, this means that we need to construct every week a city the size of Stockholm or Milan until 2050, or a city like New York or like Singapore every 4 weeks until 2050. And if we really are to keep under 1.5 degree, we therefore really need to tackle construction decarbonization and really the emission associated with the sector. At the moment, construction already contributes more than 20%, 23% of the global GHG emissions. And not only that, but the construction sector is kind of greedy and consuming more than 30% of global resources. And the design and the choice materials that we're taking now are looking for decades emissions in, and we have only 10 years to really act and stay under 1.5 degree. So we need to act now. And this also has an immediate impact on cities' resilience. For instance, concrete adds to the heat island effect and absorbs the warmth of the sun and trap gases from the car exhaust and air conditioner. So we need to be very careful about how we use it. On top of being a very high emitting industry. In cities, construction sites do generate a significant amount of air and noise pollution that do affect the well-being and the health of our citizens. And finally, we are in a moment where we need to tackle another crisis, the health crisis, that is the COVID-19 crisis, which means that governments have a tendency to really look at construction, especially of infrastructure, as a way to restart the economy and put it back to its feet. And if that is not done in a clean way, in a way that is also respectful and understandable and understanding the climate crisis, we're going to exacerbate it. Which is why we've created within C40 the Clean Construction Program to really help cities tackle this issue. It's a new topic for most cities and a topic that is outside of their usual and inventory boundaries that really requires collaboration with the industry. So to give you a quick sense of the type of challenges that cities do face when they want to tackle this issue, is that first, as their municipal stock or their municipal share of the market are usually not large enough to really make a shift and leverage a global value chain that the construction sector is. The reuse of materials, so secondary markets for construction materials, are hindered by legal and insurance issues, which are tied around safety and risks, and that really need to, that really hamper progress. And then there is a number of systems out there to collect data with platform, certification and standardization, but there is no one harmonized global system. Therefore, benchmarking is extremely difficult, and gathering the right type of data and knowing which tool to use is a bit confusing when you're trying to figure out where to act and how to be secured with baselining and data. And also some of the certifications that are in place, such as FSC for wood, are widely used, but are actually tainted by a number of social critics and ethic critics, which makes the choice harder for cities. Then there is a tendency of over-engineering or building for safety reasons, for simplicity reasons, for economic reasons, which is really detrimental to actually an efficient use of materials. But these over-engineered buildings that pour too much concrete and too much steel, for instance, are becoming aspirational in many parts of the world. And that is a very difficult thing to tackle. And finally, industrial processes such as steel milling when they are located within the city boundaries, they tend to be regulated by regional or national government, which means that cities do not have a direct power to control that. So that's kind of the type of challenges that cities are faced with, but the picture is not that bleak and they can act in a number of ways. So what I'm sharing now is what can cities actually do? And the first thing that they can really do to help, really shift the market and really bring people with them on this journey is to set the vision, to give the direction with strategies and targets that really brings confidence to the market to follow their lead and to work with them to meet this goal, which is kind of the soft power. But also this type of strategy and target very likely are going to be translated into policies and regulation. And there are a number of them, such as building codes, land use planning and zoning policies, the circular economy policies like reusing material, but also waste policies to avoid sending construction and demolition waste to landfill, and also fiscal measure and financial schemes. But Natasha, right after me, will give you much more example on all of this. And cities can actually lead the way where they do have power, therefore with municipal procurement and their purchasing power, by really looking at the specifications that they're putting in themselves when they procure. They can also really demand the sector to be more accountable and to ask for whole life cycle approach and carbon assessment through LCAs or APDs. They can demonstrate also and make the case really for this transition to a clean construction by having flagship or demonstrator project that really showcase the value that this project have. And then they can use their soft power to convene all the community of stakeholders that needs to join forces with them to get to a result. We have a number of examples, but once again, maybe I'll share that in the Q&A if that's of interest. And I'm sure Natasha might give some. So we were really pleased to launch in June the Clean Construction Policy Explorer that actually lists all of these policies, strategy, pilots, and targets that cities are putting in place. And it was really, we see it as a very complementary resources to the ones that CNCA, Bionova, and Architecture 2030 launched at the same time, which gives a framework of the type of policies needed. And so I invite you to really come and have a look and explore. It will be translated in a number of languages, including Mandarin, Chinese, in a few weeks. And yeah, we basically hope that you can explore that to have a better sense, a stronger sense of what is happening in the world. And it's a work in progress. So please do not feel shy. And if you know of any policies that are lacking, for instance, at the moment, we know that we need to boost our policy map on Chinese policy. Please do let us know, and we very happily will work with you to make that happen. Back to you, Erin.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cécile. And that will really set Natasha up well to discuss the framework like you said. So I am now going to introduce my colleague, Natasha Balwit. Natasha is the managing editor for Architecture 2030, and she performs city building stock assessments for Architecture 2030 Zero Cities Initiative, leads Architecture 2030's focus on equity in building decarbonization initiatives, and manages communications. She graduated from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and her writing has been published online in City Lab and The Atlantic. Natasha, take it away.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, so like Erin said, I'm going to talk about the city policy framework for dramatically reducing embodied carbon, which we published in coordination with C40. Over the past few decades, policies aimed at making the building sector and built environment more sustainable have been heavily focused on operational carbon emissions and operational energy. Things like incentives and requirements for energy efficiency, initiatives to reduce on-site energy use through equipment upgrades and replacements, etc. But as the world whittles down its remaining carbon budget, the spending cap on global carbon emissions, if we hope to have a good chance at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're seeing very clearly that operational energy use and emissions are just a part of the equation. Embodied carbon emissions from the production and transport of building materials will contribute hugely to building sector emissions over the coming decades, and we need policies that address this. In this graph, you can see that the first few decades of the building's existence, embodied carbon makes up the bulk of its carbon footprint. It is anticipated that embodied carbon will be responsible for 72% of carbon emissions associated with global new construction between now and 2030, and half of carbon emissions associated with global new construction between now and 2050. As the global population grows and the world urbanizes, as Cécile discussed, reducing the embodied carbon of new construction, renovation, and infrastructure will be critical. Recognizing the power of local policies to reduce embodied carbon in the built environment, we at Architecture 2030 worked with Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and BioNova to create the city policy framework for dramatically reducing embodied carbon, in collaboration with a steering group of 9 cities leading in embodied carbon policy globally. Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance is a collaboration of global cities working to meet global climate targets by achieving carbon neutrality, and BioNova specializes in the carbon management of construction. It is the developer of One-Click LCA, a carbon calculation tool. The cities in our steering group guided the selection and development of policies included in the report, so to some extent, the policy framework has been developed by cities for cities. Why? Because of the political role they occupy and because of their direct influence on buildings, neighborhoods, and construction, local governments are in a key position to influence embodied carbon reductions locally and at scale. Cities can hone in on local opportunities, respond to local conditions, and flex their purchasing power, investments in, and influence over public buildings and infrastructure. More than only changing the construction trade, cities can, through policy, influence how developers build and where, how requirements for projects are determined, how projects are designed and delivered, and how material recovery and waste are handled. Cities can shape a business environment that requires tenants or investors to ask for lower zero carbon projects, which will in turn help cascade requirements down to project teams and product manufacturers, as illustrated in this graphic. Because of this special opportunity, and because of the many co-benefits of embodied carbon reductions for cities, communities, and residents, some of which are shown here, all of the policies we outlined in the report are discussed at the city level. World Green Building Council has set 2020 as the deadline for cities to start developing a strategy to achieve net zero embodied carbon goals and to achieve net zero carbon built environment by 2050. The city policy framework for dramatically reducing embodied carbon helps cities to do that by showing the variety and impact of policies that can effectively reduce embodied carbon. The report presents options for cities and local governments to reduce embodied carbon through regulations, codes, incentives, and programs. The collection of policies in this report aims to encompass the full range of possibilities for embodied carbon policies that local governments, cities, counties, states, and provinces might implement. Some of the policies are based closely on existing examples that have already been implemented with success, and others are policies we described at the beginning of the project as dream policies, unprecedented, but possible and impactful. The report contains 52 policy cards describing policies that achieve embodied carbon reductions through the mechanisms pictured here on the left. The 52 embodied carbon reduction policies are grouped into 5 categories within which cities set policies. zoning and land use, building regulations, procurement, waste and circularity, and financial policies. An additional 2 categories grouped by asset class, municipal buildings and infrastructure. Many of the policies in the report fall into 2 or more of these categories. We look at the requirements of various policies, the standards they set or the reductions they require projects to achieve, and suggest multiple ways they can be implemented and enforced to complement and work in synergy with existing policies and initiatives. We look at embodied carbon reduction measures that intervene at different points in the value chain of buildings and materials. In the pyramid shown here, you can see that different types of measures have different potential for impact. Generally, the further upstream the intervention, the greater the potential scale of embodied carbon reduction. BioNova developed a methodology to estimate the embodied carbon reduction potential of each policy outlined in the report as a share of a city's total embodied carbon. Here, the bubble color represents the policy type, and the size of the bubble represents the embodied carbon reduction potential. You can see that the red and yellow bubbles representing policies that redefine solutions, for example, addressing needs by means other than construction, and those that reduce or replace the use of materials tend to have a larger potential impact. For each individual policy, we created a policy card to give an overview of aspects of the policy and implementation concerns. Each policy card begins with an evaluation of 4 criteria using scoring methodology developed by BioNova, including that impact calculation I showed just a minute ago. These 4 evaluation criteria ask, how impactful is it? What level of embodied carbon reductions can be expected? Are there financial costs and/or benefits for developers, builders in the city? How easily can it be implemented? And how easily can it be enforced? The card gives a quick summary of the policy and then answers the questions. What are the benefits for embodied carbon impact and also for health, equity, and economic development? Are there prerequisites to the implementation or the impact of the policy? And what are possible legal, practical, or environmental barriers, like the challenges Cécile described? How can this policy be implemented as an extension or broadening of an existing policy? And how can it interact complementarily with existing policies or programs? This we called variance. Does the policy require enforcement? If so, how can it be enforced? Can existing enforcement pathways or structures be used? And where are the relevant examples and how can they be adapted or serve as precedents? Drawing on all this, each card then provides template policy language. For most policies, the template language covers the intent of the policy, the requirements, eligible or covered projects or areas, or exemptions. The examples that we'll show you represent a range of technicality, immediate practicality, and conceptual originality. Some policies have already been implemented and are based on strong technical foundations and wealths of existing knowledge, while others we consider more out of the box or conceptual. They may require further research before they're fleshed out and detailed enough to be implemented and may not have precedents to draw from. So the 3 example policy cards I'll show represent this range. This first one, a low carbon concrete code, has been implemented in some form in Marin County, Dubai, Masdar City, and by the Norwegian Concrete Association, and is on its way to being implemented in other places as well. Precedents are well established and the technical requirements are detailed, specific, and clear. There are examples with useful code language that can be adapted. Because concrete mix design is highly dependent on local conditions, numerical limits for cement content and embodied carbon should be reviewed by local stakeholders like concrete suppliers, contractors, structural engineers, and other concrete experts familiar with local conditions. But overall, this is a high impact policy that's ready to go. The second example is a density bonus. No density bonus programs or policies with sole embodied carbon reduction criteria currently exist as far as we're aware. But there are enough other examples of other green building density bonuses that expanding or changing the criteria of those to focus on embodied carbon isn't a reach. One thing to note is that for many of the policies included in the report, the incentive structure can be separated from the technical requirements. The standards a project needs to meet to be eligible for the incentive can be defined independently of the incentive. We recognize and like the idea that there can be mixing and matching of the key elements of different policy cards. One set of requirements could be paired with one incentive structure or could follow an alternate enforcement and implementation pathway, perhaps inspired by another one of the policy cards. Many of the policies written in the report as mandatory requirements could also be implemented as voluntary incentive-based programs and vice versa. A final example we're excited about that has big potential impact is zoning for low embodied carbon building typologies. Defining the specifics and implementing a zoning policy like this requires further research. But we know, for example, that there's an embodied carbon sweet spot in building height. Buildings that are too small are not embodied carbon efficient, and neither generally are ultra high-rise buildings. So based on what we know and what we continue to learn about embodied carbon in building typology, prescriptive requirements associated with reduced embodied carbon could be developed and enforced through zoning. As awareness of embodied carbon grows, as technical knowledge and tools become more powerful, and as new embodied carbon policies continue to push the political boundaries, policies like this last one that seem like a stretch now will become more and more feasible. We plan to develop more policy cards and enrich the ones we have as more policies are put to the test in real life and as new precedents inspire us to think ever more broadly and optimistically about the possibilities for embodied carbon reduction policies. These cards are intended as a resource for policymakers to draw from, mix and match, and adapt to local context, which is obviously a more complex process than simply drawing a card. While the cards are designed as a resource for policymakers, they're also informative for practitioners. They describe the many possible approaches to reducing embodied carbon in projects. Architecture 2030 plans to continue developing complementary resources for both policymakers and practitioners to effect embodied carbon reductions. We'll be adding a number of embodied carbon policies, including some that we pulled in as examples for the city policy framework, to the Policy Precedents Index on the Achieving Zero website. We're also continually adding swatches and new information to the Carbon Smart Materials Palette, which you can find at materialspalette.org. The Materials Palette is an attribute-based approach to embodied carbon reductions in the built environment. It identifies key attributes that contribute to a material's embodied carbon impact and offers guidelines and options for emissions reductions. The Carbon Smart Materials Palette is designed to support and complement life cycle assessments, LCAs, and environmental product declarations, EPDs, while providing highly impactful guidelines for low or no carbon material selections and specifications. In this way, it illustrates the relationship between policy, industry, innovation, and individual or firm level choices. Policy sets the bar industry has to meet, and advances in industry expand the realm of what's possible for policy, making ever more ambitious policies practical and achievable. Policies are changes in industry that change the way designers and developers specify materials or design and build their projects, create a foundation for further change, spurring greater advancement to meet demand in their own cities, and serving as aspirational models and demonstrations of success for other cities. In developing this resource, we, Architecture 2030, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and BioNova, hope to show policymakers the possibilities that are out there and lower the barriers to researching, designing, and implementing embodied carbon reduction policies. As I mentioned, the full report is available for download at embodiedcarbonpolicies.com, and we welcome questions. BioNova has created a technical assistance help desk for readers looking to learn from or implement policies outlined in the report. And in fact, they'll be having a technical assistance webinar tomorrow on procurement and public projects, which you can find on the website embodiedcarbonpolicies.com/webinars. We at Architecture 2030 are also always happy to answer questions about our building decarbonization initiatives, tools, and resources. And with that, I will turn it back to Erin for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natasha. You both gave me a lot of personal inspiration that cities can actually do this. So we do have some questions and we have some time, which is great. Cécile, I'm going to start with a question for you. I know you touched on this about how cities can really shift the market, but I know C40 has been doing a lot of work and has kind of some upcoming stuff coming out. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure, thank you, Erin.
Can't hear you again.
It's it give me 2 seconds and the sounds usually comes back after 2 seconds. We don't know why.
Who knows?
Technology things. Thanks so much, Erin. That's a great question. And actually, Natasha answered a lot of it right now by saying how policy can inspire the market. But some things I wanted to maybe highlight is like the fact that because cities on their own have a small share of their own market, even in cities where they do have quite a big share, like Oslo, where they have 20% of their market share, it is not enough to move such a big value chain that is so global. So aggregating the demand from a number of cities, which is what C40 is working at the moment on, doing a clean construction declaration, is really going to put all of this demand from a number of big, powerful cities to say, this is where we're going, and really aggregating this demand to send a strong, powerful message to the market, which is also what the market is demanding, because they want this confidence that they're going to invest and they're going to put their money in the right place without, having a lack of demand afterwards. Another thing I would like to highlight, which both Natasha and I touched on, but is the fact that and I fully recognize that it's controversial to say that, but there was this sentence that actually Carl Elefante says about, the best building is the one that we do not build in terms of emissions. And we fully recognize that there is a number of cities that need still to build. Yet, the first thing to be doing before considering building new is really how do we valorize and make the most of what we already have. And cities can really set the tone there and say, let's better use our existing stock. Let's repurpose it and let's retrofit it when we cannot just reuse it or better use it. And that's actually something that is also very much relevant with one of the big trends that is happening in China at the moment with the old communities renovation work. So I would say that is something that cities can also very much lead the way on top of providing incentives, reward, investment to really help the private sector get there. So sorry, that was a long answer, but that's kind of the key points where I think I could add some more.
Yeah, that is really good points, and it leads me to another question, although I want to make sure Natasha doesn't have anything she wants to add to that.
No, I think that was a wonderfully thorough answer.
So that, I think you basically already answered this question, Cécile, but I think both of you may be able to expand upon it. When we're talking about embodied carbon, even both of you in your presentations, not to mention all of us, we do focus significantly on the new construction piece. And so I know there are some people in the audience today wondering, does this apply to my city where, despite global trends, I'm not actually expecting to see a lot of growth? And I think it's interesting that we focus on new construction for obvious reasons, and then a lot of the policies as a result focus on new construction, but that's certainly not all there is to it. So can you two each expand on really what the existing building elements of this are?
Do you want to go first, Natasha?
Sure, yeah. Well, later in the teach-in, there'll be a session called Interiors Matter, which goes in depth and shows quantifiably that interior materials and materials used in retrofits do have a significant environmental and embodied carbon impact over the lifetime of a building, especially as we are trying to shift toward preserving existing buildings and retrofitting them to be more efficient in terms of their operational energy. A lot of the materials that go into renovations and deep energy retrofits can be embodied carbon intensive, or if they're planned carefully and specified carefully, they can also not be. And so I think it goes hand in hand. I think another thing to emphasize is that the embodied carbon of materials used in the construction of buildings is huge and is a huge contributor to global embodied carbon emissions and global carbon emissions overall. But by shifting the demand for materials through policies that affect buildings, existing buildings and new buildings. By shifting that demand towards less carbon intensive products, you're also shifting the market for products that aren't used in buildings, you know, concrete and steel that are used in other kinds of manufacturing, in infrastructure, in all kinds of products that altogether combined are a huge chunk of global emissions every year.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing it around the materials that we really do focus on in our existing buildings.
I would add that basically there is not only an emission factor. There is definitely a strong emission factor with the fact that the foundation and the structure of the building are the most intensive in terms of emission, especially because they require concrete. So if you need basically to look at demolishing, that's a waste of a lot of good resources. So deconstruction is a very strong way, first, to also retain some element of cultural heritage and to bring your community together to really use this material for another, even kind of the same upgrade of a building. If it needs to be demolished for safety reasons, then deconstruct to reuse as much as possible of this material to really take this new building into a better shape. But there is also, before that, a number of design elements for new build that cannot really be applied for retrofit. But what can be applied before retrofit is repurposing. And I think that's something very new that cities are starting to understand. And for instance, I will give the example of Paris, which has since 2021 transformed office into housing at, I'm really bad with numbers, so bear with me, but it's 40,000 meters square per year since 2001 has been transformed from office to housing. And this transformation is actually from the historic buildings built in the 19th century, so what we call the Oceania building. And the reason why, actually, it's very interesting because those buildings used to be for housing in the first place. And along the course of the 20th century, they've been transformed to be commercial, office, etc. And now Paris is able to transform them again as we see a lack of demand on office space to housing again. And that is because the facade of the Haussmannian building is actually quite neutral. So first, it was built to last and not built to be knocked down in 30 years. So it was built to last. But also the neutral facade and the high ceiling allow a really different flexible use over time. So there are needs, you know, obviously you need to change the bathrooms, for instance, and all the sanitation system because the norms, etc. have changed. But that's a fantastic example on actually looking at the goals that you already have basically in your hands that can meet your city demand. And it can work anyway. If you have this type of building in place, which obviously not Haussmannian building, but historic building, what can you do with them to really valorize them and bring in, you know, strong community and social value out of it?
So follow up to that, because that's fascinating. How is this transformation taking place at a city scale? I'm assuming that the city of Paris does not own every single one of these buildings. So again, this goes back to how can cities create this transformation despite small ownership?
Definitely. There is a number of legislation and policies in place, but also incentives. So there is, and I'm going to tell it in French because it's not been really translated, but it's the Plan Climat Air Énergie Territorial, which is a mouthful even in French, which really sets a target, this one sets a target for 30% of buildings, of office building, to be reversible, which means adaptable and deconstructible by 2030. But that's the latest one. They actually also have other policies in place that really actually monitor the use and the vacancy rates of buildings. And by doing that firsthand, they know, and they can really reward or tax or incentivize investors and developers to actually do something with these vacant offices, to say, let's not sit it empty, but actually do something about it, and we'll give you financial incentives to redevelop it and make sure that it's transformed.
So a combination of carrots and sticks, as we like to
say. Exactly.
Okay, so a question just came in from the audience. So for a small country which uses hydropower as its primary source of energy, so a clean grid, I would assume, and has sustainably sourced timber, but is already down that path of concrete building construction, what do you recommend to, you know, essentially shift that train onto a different track, it sounds like?
And that's what I was saying with the over-engineered building becoming kind of the cultural demand in some other countries. Like there is, once again, it will bring more local job, more valuable sense for your communities to shift the trend and to say, okay, let's stop and think about what makes sense. If you have a clean grid, you can turn into electric machineries and really help spurring this market and you know, making it more accessible. But you can also look at, you know, if you have local loops of materials that are way more sustainable, it's really using and your planning permissions, your own procurement, bringing your stakeholders into conversation so that they can understand the economic value of local loops. And you can ask actually, and that's how Vancouver started it in a sense. They didn't put any target in place first strong. What they just said is, can you tell me what is the carbon impact of the project that you're doing? And just by asking this question, it made the developer think twice and say, oh, if they're asking this question, something will follow out of this. So we need to take action. So just asking the right sets of questions will also lead to change.
And on that, I know we're out of time, but I just, in reference to what you were talking about earlier with building reuse and the reuse of materials, a session immediately following this one will be on circular economy in the building sector. So I think that there'll be interesting conversations about the potential of that to scale in that session as well.
Yes, and on that note, we are actually out of time. But again, thank you so much, Cécile and Natasha. Fantastic, inspirational, and really appreciate you taking the time. And to everyone in the audience, I encourage you to go check out the agenda, join that circular economy session, or there are 2 others, and then that will be followed by 2 tool tutorials. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.